we'll go ahead and get started for today. Thanks everybody for joining us on this webinar on providing mental health care in the time of COVID-19. We're very excited to have Tim Gutwald here from Miller Johnson. Tim was recommended by one of our private practice social workers and one of our members of our private practice work group. Ashley, if you're on, thank you so much for making this introduction. Tim is going to give us some unique perspectives on what's been happening all around. I know there's kind of continually changing parts as we all are experiencing here with the coronavirus, and so we appreciate everyone taking some time out of your day to be here, especially at the end of the week. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get rolling into the content. We do have a couple of upcoming webinars. Our normal Lunch and Learns, which are the second Tuesday of each month from 12 to 1. The May and June events are already scheduled, so if you go to the NASW Michigan website, you can get signed up for those. As it relates to the coronavirus, there are a few resources I wanted to make sure people knew about. NASW Michigan has kind of an ongoing resource collection on our website, and that includes anything from training to policy updates to other social work practice updates. The national office is doing the same. And then the other two that we want to make sure that we're just directing folks to is michigan.gov and the CDC for ongoing information. You may have seen, I believe it was earlier today, the national office sent out a new practice alert for folks. So if you haven't checked your email, make sure to read through that. It's an update on vulnerable and marginalized populations and COVID-19, as well as they have released two upcoming programs. One is tomorrow and the other one is next week. For folks, these are free for members, so please feel free to check that out. One of them is on xenophobia and race in COVID-19, and then there'll be a teleconference next Tuesday on ethical and legal considerations as it relates to COVID-19. And we will continue to have our Friday member calls, so we will have one tomorrow from 10 to 11 a.m. to give updates that we are finding and questions that we are receiving from members across the state. So if you have questions during today's webinar, please feel free to type those into the chat box. We do have everybody muted, but if you do have questions, we'll have plenty of opportunities to get those answered throughout today. And we will be sending out CEs, so as long as you are on for 45 minutes of today's session, that will just automatically get sent, and we will email out certificates within 30 days. So thank you again for all being on today's call, and with that, I will turn it over to Tim. So just a second.
All right, thank you, Dwayne. So hopefully everyone is seeing my screen at this point and my slideshow. I appreciate everyone joining. As Dwayne mentioned, I'm going to be discussing providing mental health care in the time of COVID-19. You guys will see the usual lawyer disclaimer here in a second, saying that I am not your current attorneys, although I'd be happy to be anybody's attorney. Although, again, if Ashley's on the line, then I am, in fact, her attorney. So I'm not providing, legal advice. It doesn't create a lawyer-client relationship, but hopefully you guys will find this educational. In talking with Dwayne, after Ashley had kind of put him and I in touch together, we were going over what did we think people would be interested in hearing. And as I kind of thought, Dwayne felt that telemedicine would be something that people would like to hear some more information about. So we'll spend a majority of the webinar today kind of talking about telemedicine. As you see on the agenda, we'll discuss payment issues, privacy issues, consent issues, as well as some contracting and other issues and liability issues as well. And then kind of more briefly, I just want to highlight a few issues for people to think about. Well, I know, there are a number of smaller practices that people have that maybe they don't have a lot of employees. There are some other larger practices that some of these sick leave issues, unemployment, and other employment type issues might impact them. Hopefully you guys all have been able to get up and running on telemedicine and haven't seen too much of a disruption in your business. But in the event you have these employment issues, as well as our final topic talking about financial and other issues, might be in interest of you guys. And lastly, I do want to touch on a couple there's been, as you know, there's been, I think, 50 or so executive orders. Number 50 came out for this year related to COVID-19. And some of them, not a ton of them will have a huge impact on most mental health providers, but some of them will, and I just kind of want to briefly highlight some of those. So moving on to the telemedicine topic, we'll first address payment issues. And as you guys are probably all quite aware of, previously providing telehealth or telemedicine services was largely limited, particularly from a Medicare perspective. It was exclusively permitted for, in rural locations, and most of my clients were, it's not something that they commonly use. The other limitation related to HIPAA restrictions. Until this COVID-19 emergency declaration came up, it was very important to have a HIPAA compliant telehealth sort of patient portal or telehealth technology that you were using. Otherwise, you were violating HIPAA and risking some significant fines from the Office of Civil Rights, both the federal and the state Office of Civil Rights. So there's some expense related to getting some of that technology. There's some difficulties often for clients in accessing that technology. So that was kind of another limitation and difficulty and roadblock in the way of providing telehealth services. Well, like many things in our lives, the COVID-19 has significantly changed things. I do not give these webinars with a cat sitting on the chair next to me, but I am. So that's a small thing that has changed as a result of COVID-19. Some of the bigger things were with respect to Medicare. They issued a number of they call them Section 1135 waivers. Those waivers come in a couple different forms. There are blanket waivers that apply all the way across the country. And then there are also state-specific waivers that individual hospitals or providers or organizations can request from CMS. And Michigan has been able to do both. But for purposes of telemedicine, there was pretty early on in this crisis, there was a waiver that gave a wide berth to all professionals, and mental health professionals included in providing telehealth services. As you guys may or may not be aware, there are kind of 3 different services or types of E-type visits that can be used and billed to Medicare. There's this kind of your general well visit, then there are e-visits, and then there are, check-ins that are all of 3 of which are payable under Medicare, and which mental health providers can use some or all of them. With respect to kind of the general visits, which will be the bulk of what you guys would be doing, we just need to put the right modifier next to the usual billing, the usual billing code that you guys would use to indicate that it was provided via telemedicine, and that will be paid by Medicare. With respect to Medicare, it is important to keep in mind that these need to be a real-time exchange of information, and need to include both audio and video between the provider and the patient, and they do pay for telephone only visits, but those are kind of the lower reimbursement e-visits as opposed to your typical general code. Importantly, part of that Section 1135 waiver also permitted providers to meet with the patients when their patients are in their home, or even when the provider is in their home. And we'll get to some of the privacy issues created by that. But again, previously, the telehealth was restricted to situations where a patient was in, say, a rural hospital or some other approved location. They were not paid if the patient was at home. So again, Medicare, there's significant ability to bill and provide telemedicine, telehealth services, and have Medicare pay for those, but telephone is not one of them. With respect to Medicaid, you have even greater ability to bill Medicaid for telehealth services. This Medicaid kind of came out in like a 2-step process with respect to telehealth. First, they issued a broad proposed policy. Again, they responded quite quickly to the COVID crisis and issued this proposed policy in mid-March that permitted both audio only or video and audio to be paid for telehealth services. It also made it clear that, again, patients like Medicare can be at their homes and that's where you can provide their telehealth services. They didn't have to be in a specific hospital facility or some other approved facility in order to do that. It was a little less clear exactly. I mean, I think this was more applicable to physicians as to where they needed to be, but you can definitely be, you do not need to be in a hospital or a physician's office or your office to provide these services. Again, we'll touch on the kind of the privacy implications of some of where you are and where the patient is with respect to when you're providing these telehealth services. So there was that initial policy from Medicaid that, again, was pretty broad. And then there was a more specific policy that Medicaid instituted, another week or 2 weeks after that, that highlighted all the different codes that Medicaid would pay for all the different mental health codes that Medicaid would pay as having them be provided under via telehealth. So again, similar to Medicaid or Medicare, you pretty much are able to provide all the same services you previously were providing via telehealth to your patient population. And that brings us next to private plans. And private plans are, unfortunately, I don't have a simple answer to say, hey, you can do whatever you want. Each private plan has different policies on these things. I will add that there is federal law that requires mental health and substance abuse parity laws that require private plans and states to cover Medicare, mental health services and substance abuse services at the same level and same coverage they provide to other medical treatments. So to the extent that private plans are permitting telehealth services for kind of generic checkups or other types of visits, then they should be required to cover mental health services via telehealth as well. I have not heard too many issues either from my physician type clients or mental health clients that they're having a lot of pushback on these pay issues. But if people are having negative experiences, one area that you might be able to push back on is to point to some of those parity laws and hopefully maybe get the private plans to cover some of the services. As I kind of discussed a little bit, Medicare does not cover for telephone. Again, private plans will be up to their individual plans whether or not they're going to pay for telehealth services, but Medicaid does cover services, mental health services provided via telephone only. So that would be an option for your Medicaid clients. The alternative is to provide them via apps. There are sort of HIPAA compliant, very telehealth specific apps that you can use. But as we'll address, and hopefully you guys are all well aware of this, there's been a significant relaxation in some of these technology restrictions, and you can now use things like FaceTime or Skype or Zoom to provide some of these services, telehealth services. Another thing to consider is that I know some patients have decided, or early on they decided to leave the state of Michigan and go to their vacation homes, perhaps in a state that there hadn't been shut down quite yet, or maybe just a state with better weather, I say as I look outside and there's still snow on my car. So if they've done that, it's kind of a state-by-state analysis. Here in Michigan, the governor has signed executive orders that permit outside or physicians licensed in other states to provide care here in Michigan. I know Indiana has done the same. There are resources that if you want, I can perhaps share them with Dwayne, that are doing a good job of keeping track of what states have passed those kind of waivers. So depending on the state that your patient is located in, you may be able to continue to provide them medical services or mental health services, even though they're located in Florida or some Ohio or some other state. That brings us to privacy issues. This was really, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning of my telemedicine section, privacy was one of the roadblocks, I guess, to providing telemedicine services to a broader array of clients. And those have been significantly relaxed. Again, pretty early on in this declaration of emergency, HHS came out with some guidance indicating that they will exercise enforcement discretion when it comes to good faith attempts to, comply with HIPAA provisions. And perhaps most importantly, they made it clear that certain apps and certain types of technology will be permitted that had previously been prohibited for providing these types of telemedicine services. Most conveniently, things like FaceTime or Google Hangout, Zoom, Skype are all now allowed to be used for telehealth services, even though those may not be technically HIPAA compliant, and those entities are often or almost always unwilling to sign a business associates agreement and implement the necessary sort of encryption and other protections that would make them HIPAA compliant. So you can, if a client does not have the ability to download, a patient portal app, or oftentimes e-billing, people's electronic billing software provides ways to provide telehealth services. If there's difficulty doing that, then you guys can use some of these sort of more casual, less formal applications to provide those telehealth services. HHS said, it will not, take enforcement discretion for HIPAA violations where there's a good faith effort. And early on, there are some questions over what exactly does a good faith effort mean? Do I have to document that the client was unable to download a particular type of app or HIPAA compliant app? Do I have to try to get a BAA from some of these entities? And what HHS, their guidance on good faith, made it clear that, as long as you're not being reckless with how you're attempting to comply with HIPAA, you're not doing this in although this is largely moot, in, a McDonald's restaurant or in some other public environment where people are likely to overhear the conversation you're having with your patient, you should be, they're not going to take enforcement action against you for providing telehealth services. So the question then becomes, what do I need to protect myself and my patients to be able to demonstrate that I am making those sort of good faith efforts? So I think here is where, communication with your patients is important, and documentation that you're doing these things is important. What you want to do is, I guess there's a couple different ways you can accomplish this, is you can, prior to an appointment or as part of maybe a broader email to your clients, indicate that you can provide these services via telehealth. Say that these patients can do that while they're in their home, and advise them that they need to find a room where they can have some privacy, or some other location where they can have privacy and someone's not just going to be able to walk in or not just be able to hear what you're saying or what the patient is saying. And obviously the same would apply to everybody who is at home. You guys will want to find a room or a study or some other location where your conversation will not be overheard. If you're going to want to try and use kind of a lower tone voice, if you have, like me, 4 kids around the house, in order to, again, protect patients. So sending an email will help provide documentation that you made good faith efforts to comply with HIPAA. Alternatively, if you're just meeting with the people, with someone, you have a Skype call scheduled or a FaceTime call scheduled, at the beginning, you can request confirmation that they're in a location where people aren't going to find them, and then you can document that in your notes. I do want to point out that just because, there's these significant relaxations on HIPAA enforcement discretion does not mean that there are no obligations to, report HIPAA breaches or to protect clients and notify them if you have reason to believe someone, has their PHI has been disclosed in violation of HIPAA. So again, if you find out that someone was listening outside your door, you should notify your client about that as a HIPAA breach. The same would be true if, say, you're on a Zoom call and there's been some privacy issues and hacking on Zoom. I've not experienced this, but this has been reported. So if that were to occur to you, you would want to comply with HIPAA's breach notification requirements, in which case, on a one-on-one type situation would just require you to send a communication to the patient indicating that HIPAA, that you believe there was a breach. And you want to go through, there's kind of a process for determining if you need to send that notification, whether PHI was kind of acquired and maintained, and a variety of other number of efforts. So I don't want people to relax too much on the HIPAA. I think the main relaxation here is that you can use apps to provide telehealth that were previously prohibited. All right, so this brings us to the consent issue. Again, you're still going to need to get informed consent from individuals. Again, I think this can be accomplished in a couple of different ways. If you're using certain apps, will have a consent feature that can be sort of seamlessly integrated, and a client can simply click a button to consent to, to sign up and to agree to certain informed consent type languages. Or alternatively, you could email people in advance of an appointment, and you don't need to do this necessarily every time with sort of the email that has a broader consent form that they would kind of agree to. And then when they get on the call, you can say, hey, did you see that consent form that I sent you? Do you agree with everything that you see in there? And then you can document in your notes that they in fact did agree to that consent. And then also at the beginning of each session, my recommendation is that you ask the client, just, are you okay with us providing, meeting via telehealth as opposed to in person, and then document that they consented to that as well. You're going to need to put, when you're billing Medicaid, for example, you'll need to put, if it was done via telephone, you'll need to note in the bill that it was provided via telephone. All right, so that's kind of the way to obtain consent and then document consent. One thing to keep in mind, and again, I don't want to have people be alarmed if they've not been doing some of these things. I don't think you need to be too alarmed about it, but I think on a moving forward basis, it's good practice to consider including additional language in an informed consent that says, hey, since we're using this technology, there's a possibility that this might get interrupted, that this might not be the ideal way I might decide that this is not the proper way for us to meet, that we need to meet in person or something like that. And also let them know that it's possible that the privacy might be compromised and that you'll notify them if that occurs, but basically get them to acknowledge and agree to those risks. And if people have questions about the kind of language I can provide, I'm happy to provide some standard kind of form language that I've used have had clients use. So I think that covers what additional terms you should use. Like I said, I think the main ones you want to think about that wouldn't be already included in your general consent type form would be addressing sort of the technology specific issues and concerns that might arise. So again, breaches, and either them acting inappropriately and you needing to cut it off, or you determining that this is really not appropriate for the type of treatment that they need, and that you have the right to kind of to end the conference or end the telemedicine visit if you think that's appropriate. So contracting and other issues, I've helped a few different clients since this started to contract with telemedicine companies, and for the most part, the terms are pretty standard. And I don't recommend too many, the need to make too many changes. There's a couple of situations where I saw some indemnification language. So there's usually a section in these contracts, in case you aren't too familiar with them or you don't generally, go through these with a fine-tooth comb, where I thought it made the telemedicine companies completely immune, even if sort of someone hacked them and was able to access client information that way. So pay attention to indemnification language. If you are signing, if you're going to use some sort of app or company or technology that is claiming to be HIPAA compliant as opposed to, Skype or Zoom or some other more informal method, then make sure you have them sign a business associate agreement. And, the terms, you can find a lot of template business associate agreements. Most likely the company itself will have a template one. So just make sure that is in place, because if they're unwilling to sign a BAA and they're claiming to be HIPAA compliant, that should be a big red flag that they're not actually going to be HIPAA compliant. Even if they say they are, they need to sign that BAA in order to be completely HIPAA compliant. Again, I kind of, how do you document consent? That's where, some of these telemedicine companies are helpful, and that they can have clients, hit a button, as opposed to either kind of having to read consent or send consent in advance and confirm that they do consent, and then documenting it on your own. Oh geez, look like these are actually, I apologize, these are these are from the last slide that got carried over into this one. So I think that kind of covers the contracting and other issues. Oh, one other issue that I did want to talk about in telemedicine is, professional liability issues. Remember, you're still providing a professional service. You still need to comply with your ethical obligations. You need to conclude on your own that it is important, it is proper and appropriate for you to be providing and meeting with this particular patient in a, via telemedicine, and that's an appropriate means to provide the care and continue treating them. So that's another issue to keep in mind. It frankly will be a little bit more difficult, I would imagine, to, successfully, without being right with someone and to be able to see their body language and have good visibility of where they're looking, that's going to complicate your professional services a little bit, but you need to keep in mind that you still have all those obligations. And you also, if someone's expressing suicidal ideation, you need to consider duties to warn, and all of those other things that you would have to consider in the, if someone acted like that and they were sitting in front of you. None of those issues are, relaxed, or you're not immune from, malpractice or other similar suits just because you're practicing via telemedicine. All right, so, that kind of, I think, summarizes the telehealth issues. We can kind of move on to the employment type issues. Again, I do practice some employment law. My law firm has provided a whole host of seminars and webinars on and issued client alerts addressing some of the state and federal sick leave policies. So for those of you who have employees, I highly encourage you to take a look at those and make sure you understand your obligations and your employees' rights under these various laws. I'll just my main point in bringing that up today is to make sure that you guys recognize that, there's significant protections for employees with respect to if they are sick or have symptoms of COVID, or if they need to take care of children or other family members who are sick with COVID. They are protected under both state and federal law, and they can't be retaliated against. They can't be discharged. And I'm sure none of you all would do that sort of thing, but I just want to make sure you are aware of that. Unfortunately, we've had a number of clients who, because of a drop in business, particularly my medical clients who can't perform surgeries, they've had to lay off staff and implement furloughs. And, you just want to be cognizant of whether you're going to make this a permanent layoff or the plan is to have it be a temporary layoff, because that implicates there's something called the WARN Act. And if you plan on being a permanent layoff, you might have obligations to provide notification up to 60 days in advance. Although, we believe that that's not required under the circumstances. But again, these are just kind of issues that I want people to highlight and people to think about. And if you have specific questions, then, either I can answer them after, or I can put you in touch with one of my colleagues who handle these issues a little bit more frequently than me. One of the upsides with respect to the actions the government, both state and federal, have taken is the unemployment benefits have been expanded, and people who are being laid off or who are unable to work due to being sick or having to take care of sick individuals, they are often entitled to unemployment. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that you're not necessarily in these situations leaving people without any sort of money coming in, that the government has expanded unemployment and increased the amount that people receive. So, and are also, for those who are interested, there are ways you can supplement people's unemployment, so it's covered 80% or so is covered under unemployment, and then employers rather, are allowed to, fill in that rest of the 20%, or you can continue to pay for people's healthcare benefits, or a variety of options. And again, we've addressed these in pretty significant detail in some of our webinars, and I believe Dwayne has linked to those for you guys at your website, so you guys can view all of those. Or again, that's something we can address after this show, after this webinar. All right, so financial and other issues. We've gotten a lot of questions from healthcare clients and general business clients related to the Paycheck Protection Program. Again, this was part of the big CARES Act that set aside a whole lot of money for healthcare providers. It created this Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses. And I mostly just want to kind of touch on the broad themes of that. So employers who have fewer than 500 employees are entitled to apply for these funds under the Paycheck Protection Program. And you can get, I believe it's 250% of a couple months worth of payroll. And as long as you use that money, 75% of that money to pay for payroll and as long as you sort of rehire people or don't lay people off, then those loans would be forgiven under the Paycheck Protection Program. So that's something that I've had a number of clients take advantage of. Again, depending on the nature of your practice, if you're a larger practice and have sort of a larger Medicare population, then the CARES Act also expanded the Medicare Advanced Payment Program. And what that is Medicare will essentially give a 4-month cash advance to healthcare providers based on your last 3 months worth of Medicare claims. So they will issue a payment. You then have 120 days before they will start recouping that money. The goal here is to infuse practices with some cash right now, and then hopefully 120 days from now, COVID will have died down. Business will be closer to something like usual, and then as claims are made, the Medicare will recoup that money. So that'll start happening at day 120, and if come day 210 you have not completely repaid the advanced payment that you received, then you would need to do so, or they would start charging interest. And the interest is at 10%, so you're going to want to pay that off. Probably less helpful for the majority of people on this call, but rather helpful for some of my other clients, was the CARES Act Emergency Fund. It was a $100 billion fund. I'll touch on this very briefly, I promise. And the government distributed $30 billion based on Medicare billings to people. So that was helpful to, in particular, to hospital clients, but it's possible that some people, if you bill Medicare, you might have gotten some amount of money. Just beware that there are specific terms and conditions that apply to that. And unless you're treating patients who have COVID or potentially have COVID, then it's not clear that you would actually be eligible for that. I think it's kind of a tough question with respect to mental health providers. Like if a patient, needs to be seen via telehealth because they think they have COVID, or they're having some under significant stress because a family member has COVID, or they think they might have COVID, then, I think it's possible that mental health providers would be eligible for that. Kind of the last issue here that I wanted to touch on were some of the Governor Whitmer's executive orders. So obviously we're all under lockdown, and we have been so for quite some time. There was a recent frequently asked question asked with respect to whether or not, someone having sort of a significant mental health issue, a mental health emergency, would that be sort of life-sustaining treatment such that you would be able to see that patient in person? And the answer to that question is yes. So if a client is having a very severe, bout of depression or some other mental health issues, and they're expressing suicidal ideation, or you can see that it's, you know, really significantly putting them at risk, or then you can meet with that person in person rather than just doing it via telehealth. I would suspect that would be, you know, kind of few and far between, but I did want to make people aware that that was something that's available to you. Also, with respect to the governor's order, as far as essential workers go, my interpretation is that all of you would be essential workers. The order, or you guys would be a critical infrastructure workers. The order itself identified a number of critical infrastructures. One of them was healthcare and healthcare workers. And those individuals are allowed to travel to go to work. And so I have told clients when they've asked that, you know, my recommendation is to work remotely if you possibly can, but if there's some reason people needed to go into the office, then I think you guys are permitted to do so under the executive order. Kind of the last I think relevant executive order to everybody would be some of the orders related to kind of continuing medical education and licensing issues. The governor has issued orders that, you know, if testing is required to continue your license or even to obtain a license, then that has kind of temporarily been, that requirement has been suspended to the extent that the tests can't be taken. The same is applicable to continuing medical education requirements for people as well. So that some of those requirements, those licensing requirements, have been relaxed because there's a recognition that it might not be possible to complete all those or fulfill all those. I know when I've called licensing, they're all working remotely. It's difficult to get a response from them. So I think there's just a general recognition of the need for people to be flexible and for the government to be flexible here. So I think the kind of broader advice, I've been doing way more than I usually do. Usually in the healthcare field, things are quite black and white, and I can often say, no, you can't do that, or yes, you can do that, or sorry, you have to follow that rule and you must meet this deadline. I think there's just a much broader recognition of flexibility from both the state and federal government when it comes to many of these things. And so I've often been telling clients, okay, you know, you're doing this for the right reasons, to provide clients with better access to care. You can also do things with respect to telehealth. You are permitted to forgive copays. You don't have to charge copays. You don't have to charge some of the cost sharing mechanisms as well. I know, at least with respect to, you know, COVID related issues, the insurers themselves are covering those copays. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. I think that mostly covers everything. So to the extent that we have questions, Dwayne, I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Great, we had a few questions come through. Before I get to that, I just want to give some clarification about some of the executive orders as it relates to continuing education and licensing. And I know NASW here has been giving out some guidance, and on our Friday calls, we've been answering sometimes a little bit more specifics around that. So we've got clarification from the Board of Social Work here, specifically as it relates to a couple of things. The first around CEs. So the governor's executive order does state that Laura may renew a license without continuing education requirements being met for this renewal period. What the Board of Social Work is telling us that social workers should still attempt in good faith to get their continuing education if at all possible at this time. Exceptions may be made for folks who have had conferences canceled and there's no possible way to get additional CEs over the next couple of weeks. What we were told is if they see a case where somebody was missing 45 of their 45 CEs and then they blamed it on COVID, it's not likely that they're going to get an extension for that. But if it's a few CEs that clearly got interrupted because of this virus, then they just want folks to make sure you have documentation of that at this time. The second piece is around fingerprinting. So this impacts mostly limited license and new applicants. Fingerprinting organizations still are operating in many parts of the state, some on a limited schedule, but Laura is requesting that folks attempt to get their fingerprints taken if at all possible. If that is not possible in your particular area, they recommend reaching out to them, and they may exempt that requirement for new applicants at this point. And then the third piece of clarification around the executive order and continuing education is that there is also a section in there that says response work being done to COVID-19 may count towards CEs. So that is a very gray worded executive order, like most of these, and there is no particular clarification about what can count as COVID response towards continuing education. So the Board of Social Work is hoping that most folks aren't going to be relying on that particular executive action to complete their CEs. But if you found yourself, again, short a few hours and you've been doing response work in some capacity, whether that's in person, if you're doing food bank stuff, if you're doing research, as long as that is documented, they will take that into account on the renewal side of things come next year. So just a couple of pieces of clarification that I want to give on that. One of the questions that came through that related to something you talked about earlier around HIPAA from Kaylee, wasn't some of the restrictions of technology listed so that HIPAA is not violated and so that clients can still get their services? I don't know if you want to answer that, Tim, or I can look into.
Yeah. The answer is yes. Many of the HIPAA restrictions have been sort of lifted, or they're going to exercise discretion. So again, you can use things like FaceTime or Google Hangouts or Zoom or Skype to provide your clients with telehealth services. You do not need to find a HIPAA compliant technology application or other technology in order to provide those telehealth services. As long as you're making good faith efforts to protect your clients, mental health records and their PHI, then you're going to be fine under HIPAA.
Great. And kind of a tangential question to that is, do we have any guess at this point until what date these good faith programs are going to last?
I'm trying to remember. It's at least till the end of, so the HIPAA one is going to be controlled by the federal declaration of emergency. And I believe the guidance was they'll last for 30 days after that declaration of emergency is rescinded or ended. I'm fairly confident that's what it is. That way it's not, one day I can do this and you have, appointments scheduled for the rest of the week and suddenly everyone needs to hop in their cars and try and drive. And I think there's also a recognition that some of these, there's still going to be difficulties and with respect to COVID, and people might be unwilling or not want to travel as much and meet in person as much as they will. So I think there's a recognition that people have 30 days to adjust to that. And that, that's the other thing. Real quick, Dwayne, you're talking about, CEs for people. At some point, you're going to have to, at least the executive orders, if I'm recalling the language correctly, the expectation is you're going to catch up on these at some point. So, these are as far from a get out of jail free card as far as those go. So you're really better off trying to complete those if you can in any sort of way.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I know as it relates to some of these billing changes and as some of these insurance panels open up the opportunities for telehealth and audio, NASW is going to be advocating for some of these hopefully to stay as long-term policy changes, but we know that probably as like HIPAA, that's going to be more of a short-term piece, but our hope as an association is that some of this that has been very hesitant to change for a long time and probably needed to, that may actually just keep long-term from here on out.
Yeah, I think there's a decent chance that happens, particularly in the mental health arena, but it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting. And relatedly, and I kind of see one of these questions is, I talked about malpractice liability, and for people who previously weren't really using a lot of technology, you might want to take a look at whether or not you have sort of cyber liability protection. especially since, again, patients might want to continue receiving telehealth services to the extent that that's permitted as we get on past any sort of this COVID era. And so you might want to check on that just to make sure you have protection in the event that there is a hack. And I wouldn't think that would be particularly expensive for most of you guys.
No, it's not. And NASW Assurance, for those of you on the line who have your liability through NASW, they have a cyber liability rider that you can add on that's not additionally much expensive. And if we have time at the end, I'll show you some resources through their website, which I did put in the chat log. They also have a sample telehealth informed consent form that you can use or modify, as well as some frequently asked questions about teletherapy, which are really well laid out page. But there are two questions that kind of came through around the copays, and I'm wondering if you have some guidance on that. Are private insurances reimbursing for copays during right now? And do we have to demonstrate the session is COVID related? If so, how? And then kind of also with that, if you forgive copays, do you need a hardship contract, or how do you document that?
So I'll take that last question first. No, you don't need a hardship contract at this during the kind of the state of the emergency. A couple different, the various entities for the state and federal government who are worried about sort of kickbacks, the anti-kickback statute or beneficiary inducement, have said that they're going to exercise discretion like the Office of Civil Rights with respect to HIPAA. So these entities will exercise discretion with respect to, forgiving some of these loans. That, again, there's a recognition that people are in need of mental health services, and there's also, financial issues going on right now. So you do not have to document a financial issue to forgive a copay. I would document, to the extent that you're hoping to get coverage from an insurance company, I would document, in the record that this was COVID related. There's probably, I'm trying to think of the best way to do that. I don't know that you just want to, I think you'd want to make it fairly prominent that the patient was calling because, they were stressed out by COVID. And I do not know how generous healthcare providers or healthcare insurers are when it comes to, viewing what is and is not COVID related. It's obviously pretty easy on the medical side, but less clear from the mental health perspective.
Great, perfect. And I might tackle this one. So what information can you share about a mental health clinician billing under the credentials of a mental health supervisor? What would be required to do that? And I'm guessing, Savannah, that question is for a limited licensed person who traditionally would bill under their fully licensed person, where traditionally that person would need to be on site, quote unquote. And that, at least for right now, our understanding is that good faith, as long as supervision is still happening, even if that's remote, that you can still bill under that supervisor at this time. Okay. Can we text clients instead of emails for consent to treatment and session times?
I think that would be fine, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, there are social workers that do text, especially as it relates to reminders for meetings and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can always, you want to be careful with text and not include unnecessary PHI and that sort of thing. But I think even outside of this, you can text to confirm that. But again, I do think, in light of everything that's going on, if you have patients that are in particular need of attention, that texting even from some PHI, again, that goes to that good faith compliance with HIPAA. I think that would be okay here.
All right, another question from Abby. Do independent therapists qualify for small business loans? For some of us at home with children, it's impossible to work more than a couple of hours a day.
My understanding is yes, that the Paycheck Protection Program loans apply to sort of, independent contractors, sole proprietors as well.
Yeah, I agree too, and it's our understanding that social workers, especially those in private practice, would also qualify for unemployment at this time as kind of a gig worker or independent contractor.
That's correct too. Yep.
And that just started on Monday, although I know that the lines and website is still crazy busy. So be patient with them as much as possible. Okay, from Cynthia, for PCP appointments, do you see that telemedicine may become new practice for routine, yearly medical review for patients that are on controlled medications for chronic conditions? I guess that's like kind of foreseen.
You know, I don't know. I do think that I do think that some of these sort of relaxation of FaceTime requirements are more likely to stick, as opposed to, so, you know, where it's just kind of standard renewals. I could see that some of those will continue on. I mean, right now you can even provide the DEA permits prescribing of controlled substances via telehealth.
And then there are a couple of questions around Medicare. I did reply to Julia's question in there, but I'll just reiterate it. So does Medicare cover audio-only phone visits? And as of now, no. The Medicare does not. NASW National has been advocating for this for quite a few weeks now, years really. But they've been asking members to also advocate at this point to open that up. And we're working with our federal legislative partners and lobbyists to get that passed, although it has not happened to this point. And I think along with this, Patricia had a question. I've experienced my elder Medicare clients having trouble with telemed and prefer to use the telephone. Is there leniency with billing Medicare for elders using telephone? And I think that kind of answers it right now. We're working on it, but that one is one that's taking a little bit longer to move.
I would agree. Like I said, I know that there are a few limited codes that are called e-visits, and I'm not sure whether those could potentially cover telephone visits, but they're very short in nature, and so it's not going to be kind of your typical counseling type session. So again, I'm not positive that those codes would apply for mental health services, but there's a very, very limited for a telehealth for telephone only. But Medicaid, you're fine. And I'm not sure, Joanne, you would probably have a better idea than me with respect to private insurers, but my guess is that they're not paying for that for telephone only either.
Yeah, correct. There are a couple of questions around specific modifier codes. Tim, I don't know if you have much experience with that. We did discuss that pretty at length on our private practice call on April 3rd. So any member, if you want to go back and watch or listen to that group meeting, that would be what I recommend as it relates to those codes that folks are using right now. I can't remember all of that off the top of my head, but it is all available right on the NASW Michigan website. Okay, so kind of going back to the forgiving copay, just Connie wants clarification that there's not a risk of fraud if you forgive someone's copay.
Correct. That's true.
And it looks like the last question, a little different topic. Do you know if families can apply for SNAP benefits at this time?
That's kind of outside my scope of expertise.
I will look into that. I feel like I did hear about that recently, but we'll see if I can find that while we're talking right now. But there are no other questions that I've seen come through, but I did want to just quickly, Tim, I'm going to switch it back to my screen really quick and just show a couple of resources that I had found while we were talking that I just wanted to make sure people knew how to access. One of them, if you are a NASW Assurance Services policyholder for liability, if you go to their website, you'll see lots of good stuff if you go to the Considering Teletherapy link right on the front. And then they've got a lot of different links here that are going to be very helpful right now as it relates to teletherapy, especially this FAQ one. And there's that teletherapy consent form here at the bottom. So if you click that, it will just give you an example other one is that frequently asked questions, and I think that that one's going to be really helpful for folks too, because it's going to answer some of those maybe more simple questions. Listing of HIPAA compliant data storage system. You'll see that over here on the right. Nope, there's not a list of that. Does a social worker have to keep a breach log, right? Yes. Some of these they tried to make them as black and white as possible as some of the answers. Is Skype secure for telemedicine? Only if the internet connection is secure. So I think that how they had this filtered here is going to be really helpful for folks. And then the other resource I wanted to show people was ASWB. So we had talked about practicing across state lines. So Michigan did open up so folks from other states can see Michigan clients. It is not across the board. So Michigan social workers cannot see clients in every particular state. However, many states have moved to more flexible reciprocity right now. And ASWB, the Association of Social Work Boards, has the most comprehensive list right now of that. So if you click on their COVID-19 updates, and then they kind of have three main tabs. If you go to the For Social Workers tab, then you can choose the state or province that you have questions about and what changes have been made in terms of reciprocity. So if you click on Michigan, it'll open up the executive order that impacts social workers here. And so you can get a good sense through ASWB's website, and they've been updating theirs daily as best as possible, because we know some of this is changing several times a day. So I just wanted to show a couple of those resources for folks as those become available. Let me just see if there are any last questions that come through. Yep, someone just asked if I can put the consent form on the NASW chapter website for NASW members to access that form. Yep, and that is through the Assurance Service website, is open for anybody. You don't have to be a policyholder to access that or the frequently asked questions. Can you clarify which insurances pay for copays? I don't know, Tim, if you have a snapshot in your brain of that. I definitely do not.
I know at least for the COVID related, I know that Priority Health does, Blue Cross Blue Shield, United, Cigna and Aetna all have agreed to waive copays when it comes, or pay copays when it comes to COVID related services.
Great. And if folks think of other questions between now and even tomorrow, we'll have our membership call from 10 to 11 tomorrow, where we'll have some more in-depth answers to some other questions that we've been following around COVID. I really thank Tim for your time and your expertise here. I know it has been a crazy day in terms of news and things going on, so we appreciate it. If folks have questions for Tim, please feel free to email me and I could forward those along. I will look for information about SNAP, and if I do find that they are opening up applications right now, I will put something out on our social media platforms, so check for that probably in the next 10 minutes. At this point, and maybe just one last question from Abby that came through. Are insurances paying the waived copays right now?
So the what copays?
Waived.
I'm not sure about that one.
I'm not sure either. Well, we can look into that, Abby. And Gwendolyn answered my question about SNAP. She said, yes, you can apply for SNAP online through MyBridges. Wonderful. Thank you, Gwendolyn. And Cynthia just had kind of a protection question. If you volunteer for the mental health hotline, how are we being protected from being sued? So as of right now, none of the mental health hotlines are therapy lines. And I think that is pretty important distinction as it relates to liability and your protection for being sued. Most of them are peer support lines. The hotline that the governor announced earlier this week is a peer support line. There may be referrals then made from that, but the folks who are volunteering for that, it shouldn't impact your liability, more kind of an advice line right now. Now, Wayne State School of Social Work is also working on and have developed a list of social workers working to give advice for first responders and essential workers out in Metro Detroit. I would, again, just make sure you check in with your liability insurance as it relates to some of those volunteer opportunities that are kind of in that gray zone, and make sure that you have liability insurance, especially if you're doing it outside of your regular employment. So that may be something that you need to get additional coverage for, that if you just have coverage through your employer, you might want to just back yourself up with that. All right, well, it is at 4 o'clock, so I want to thank you all again for hanging on this line. I will make sure CEs get out probably within the next couple of weeks. And if folks have additional questions, feel free to send them over to me. And again, thank you so much, Tim, for sharing with us, and we really appreciate your time.
All right, thank you very much. And if people have questions, obviously, please don't abuse my time, but I'm happy to answer questions if you want to reach out directly to me or through Dwayne. In my experience, mental health professionals are the least likely to abuse that sort of offer, so I'm not too worried about it. So thanks again, everybody, for having me, and everyone stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.